You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Orders were shouted to fall back through Gettysburg onto Cemetery Hill, and it was high time to do so, as from all sides Confederate masses approached the town on the double quick. Passing a church on the outskirts, Surgeon Schultz, frightened to death, stopped me and asked if he would be taken prisoner if caught. I said, "Put a white handkerchief on your arm and attend to the wounded. There are lots of them in the streets." This delayed me, and some 20 Confederates came rushing on, hallooing to me to surrender. One excited fellow got hold of Caesar's bridle with his left hand and was ready to lunge his bayonet into me with his right, screaming, "Surrender! Get down, you damned Yank!" "You be damned," I answered, and cut off his hand with my Saxon sword. Then I started off, gave spurs to my horse, but to my horror found myself in a yard, surrounded by high fence rails. They shot at me from behind and demanded surrender. Caesar, with an enormous effort, jumped the fence and made off towards Cemetery Hill. Reaching the arch, I dismounted and examined my horse. The poor fellow had been shot twice, but they were only slight flesh wounds. My left leg was wounded, and I felt blood filling my right boot. My left shoulder strap had been shot away, and the shoulder was badly scratched. One bullet had damaged the back of my saddle, partially protected by a rubber blanket, and when I tried to replace my saber, I found the scabbard bent. I had hurt my right knee badly on the fence and torn off one of my stirrups. Captain Frederick Baron von Fritsch, 68th New York Infantry, von Gilsa's Brigade.
They carried the wounded in there as fast as they could. We took the cushions off the seats, and some officers came in and said, "Lay them in the aisles." Then we did all we could for the wounded men. After a while, they carried in an awfully wounded one. He was a fine officer. They did not know who he was. A doctor said to me, "Go bring some wine or whiskey or some stimulant." When I got outside, I thought of Mr. Geyer near the church. "Well," I said, "Mr. Geyer, can you give me some wine?" He said, "The rebels will be in here if you begin to carry that out." "I must have it," I said. "Give me some." I put it under my apron and went over to the church with it. They poured some of it into the officer's mouth. I never knew who he was, but he died. Well, I went to doing what they told me to do, wetting cloths and putting them on the wounds and helping. Every pew was full, some sitting, some lying, some leaning on others. They cut off legs and arms and threw them out of the windows. Mary McAllister, resident of Gettysburg.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 336 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, when we left off last time, it was around 4:30 on the afternoon of Wednesday, July 1st, 1863. about 9 long hours after the first shot of the battle had been fired, and after a determined stand north and west of Gettysburg, the positions held by the 1st and 11th Corps had finally collapsed, crumbling under the weight of the Confederate pressure that had been applied all along the line.
The streets of the town were now teeming with fleeing Yankees. In a few cases, the retreat took on the appearance of a complete rout, with some men overcome with panic, while in other cases the retreat was more orderly. But despite the best efforts of some officers, most regiments quickly lost cohesion, and the mass of Federal troops became a jumbled mob in the streets and back alleys of Gettysburg, with units, or what was left of them, trying to stay more or less together, grouped around the regiment's colors or following some officer who thought he knew where to go.
On a map, the 1863 town of Gettysburg presents a neat grid of small streets intersecting at right angles and grouped around the diamond. But Civil War Gettysburg was also a town of alleys running behind the streets, crisscrossing in a sort of internal labyrinth, sometimes, all too often, dead-ending abruptly at board fences. Into those streets and alleyways from the north and west poured the retreating remnants of the 1st and 11th Corps. With Confederates entering town right behind them, right on their heels, Union soldiers flooded the streets or turned blind corners and hopped over fences as they made their way toward Cemetery Hill on the south side of town.
The residents of Gettysburg, caught up in the whirlwind of retreat, mostly clustered in their basements, doing their best to ride out the storm. Salome Myers remembered that she, quote, knelt shivering and prayed while the noise above our heads, the rattling of muskets, the unearthly cries mingled with the sobbing of children, shook our hearts.
Other residents, more curious than fearful, watched the wild scenes unfold from upstairs windows, even as the occasional shell crashed into some of the buildings of town, while bullets ricocheted off the bricks or splintered window sills and door frames. In some instances, Federal soldiers sought refuge in homes, where most were rooted out and captured once the Confederates occupied town. A few managed to escape detection, though. For example, Corporal Leander Wilcox of the 151st Pennsylvania burst in the back door of Catherine Foster's house on Washington Street and was hidden in Foster's potato bin.
One of the most tragic stories of the day involves Chaplain Horatio Howell of the 90th Pennsylvania. The Christ Lutheran Church on the south side of Chambersburg Street was being used as the hospital for John Robinson's division of the 1st Corps. As rebel soldiers dashed into town, a Federal officer came out onto the church steps. It was Howell who, unlike most chaplains, followed Army regulations to the letter, including the wearing of an officer's uniform and sword.
According to the most likely account of what happened, a passing South Carolinian demanded the Yankee officers surrender his sword, and when Howell protested, trying to explain that he was a non-combatant, the rebel soldier, who was obviously in no mood to argue, shot him dead.
Today you can see a monument to Reverend Howell at the foot of the front steps outside the Christ Lutheran Church, less than 1 block west of the Diamond.
Hundreds of Union soldiers, unable to get away, were captured, but perhaps the best remembered incident of the retreat through town has to do with a Federal who was successfully able to evade capture. While making his way back to Cemetery Hill, Brigadier General Alexander Schimmelpfennig found himself cut off in the backyard of Anna Garlack on Baltimore Street. Seeing no escape, the Prussian-born officer hid behind Garlack's small woodshed, where he remained for the next 3 days, finally emerging, very sore but very much relieved, on the morning of July 4th, once he was certain the Confederates had vacated the town.
History never says goodbye. It just says, See you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
General Schimmelpfennig was mounted and in retreat on Washington Street. At that time, there was an alley running from Washington Street, which ended at the barn of my father, Henry Garlack, and connected with another alley north to Breckenridge Street, but then had no outlet south. He turned down this alley and then found that his only outlet in either direction was toward the Confederates.
The rebels were at his heels, and when he reached our barn, his horse was shot from under him. He jumped over the alley fence into our yard and ran toward Baltimore Street, but the rebels were in possession of that street, and he realized that he must be captured. There was an old water course in our yard at the time, now converted into a sewer, and for 12 feet from the street it was covered with a wooden culvert, and General Schimmelpfennig hurriedly crawled out of sight under the culvert.
He remained there until after dark. It was night when my mother went out of the house following the path to the stable for the purpose of feeding our hogs. Along the path was the woodshed, and against the shed and running some distance from it was several ranks of wood, and in front of the wood 2 swill barrels. We had been using wood from the rank nearest the barrels, and there was a space between the barrel and the next rank of wood big enough to hold a man. As Mother went up to the barrel, the general said, "Be quiet and do not say anything."
He had taken off the wood and built a shelter over his head to better hide himself. It was remarkable that he had not been captured. The rebels had torn down fences from Breckenridge Street southward through the yards, and there were rebels on all sides of us, and any movement of his in daytime might have been seen from a number of points. On the second day, Mother made a pretense of going to the swill barrel to empty a bucket. In the bucket, however, was water and a piece of bread, and instead of those going into the barrel, they went to the general in hiding. My mother was so afraid that she had been seen and that the general would be found that she did not repeat this.
General Schimmelpfennig was in hiding between the barrel and the rank of wood from the evening of the first day to the morning of July 4th. That last night everything grew so quiet, and as soon as there was light we got up and Mother hurried down and out, anxious to know what had become of the man. He was already out of his hiding place before she reached him. When I first saw him, he was moving across our yard. He was walking stiff and cramped-like. At the fence was a number of Union men, and they proved to be his own men. They thought he had been killed, and when they saw him they went wild with delight. They seemed beside themselves with joy. Anna Louise Garlack, resident of Gettysburg.
Chased from town, the retreating Union soldiers at last arrived at their designated rallying point on Cemetery Hill, where, for the moment, chaos reigned. Rufus Dawes of the bloodied 6th Wisconsin recalled that as he looked around, he saw nothing but a, quote, confused rabble of disorganized regiments of infantry and crippled batteries.
There was, however, the welcome sight of Orland Smith's brigade of the 11th Corps, the only fresh Federal brigade on the field, presenting a solid front on the hillside where it had waited in reserve for most of the day. Otis Howard and other officers moved about the hilltop, getting the survivors of the day's fighting into position on either side of Smith's brigade, ready to repel the next Confederate assault.
The weary remnants of regiments filed into their assigned positions and sagged to the ground in exhaustion. Ordnance officers issued new supplies of ammunition, and the men refilled their cartridge boxes. The day had not gone as Otis Howard had hoped. Some would later question his judgment, but no one ever questioned Howard's bravery. Amid the buzzing of bullets from Confederate sharpshooters in the town, and under the imminent threat of overwhelming attack, his courage and calmness in these moments was contagious. Meeting a regiment just reaching Cemetery Hill, Howard ordered the color bearer to turn around and plant his flag on a stone wall at the base of the hill and the edge of town, where the men were to rally. "All right," the sergeant replied. "If you will go with me, I will." Otis Howard took the flag himself, walked down to the desired position, and rallied the regiment there. An officer of the 25th Ohio wrote that the general's performance in this crisis, quote, taught me what a cool and confident man could do.
It wasn't long before Howard was joined by Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock was on the errand to which Meade had dispatched him at midday. His arrival on the scene at Gettysburg created an awkward situation, since Howard outranked Hancock, but Meade's order placed Hancock in command over him.
By the most reliable accounts of the exchange, the shocked Howard took the surprising development in stride, but he was deeply humiliated at what appeared to be Meade's lack of confidence in him. Later that evening, after things had quieted down, Howard sadly wrote to Meade that being placed under Hancock, quote, has mortified me and will disgrace me, end quote. He had, he stated, done as well as any of the Army of the Potomac's corps commanders would have done in similar circumstances. And Howard may have been right about that, but in truth, except for selecting Cemetery Hill as a fallback position, he hadn't done all that well. He had allowed the 11th Corps to deploy badly, had withheld reinforcements until they were too late to do any good, and had delayed ordering the retreat until his troops were already giving way and had no choice but to withdraw with considerable disorder and heavy losses. In our opinion, the best that can be said of Howard's performance as a commander at Gettysburg is that he was bright and dedicated, and the battle was a learning experience for him.
In fairness to Otis Howard, the situation he inherited at Gettysburg on July 1st had been all but impossible. Reynolds, not Howard, had made the decision to try to hold the town. The Federal forces immediately at hand, the 1st and 11th Corps, had been inadequate for the task, but Howard had fought on throughout the day in constant expectation of the arrival of Slocum's 12th Corps and hopefully also Sickles' 3rd.
Howard was unaware that Meade's Pipe Creek circular was creating confusion and uncertainty with Slocum and Sickles, so that those reinforcements he, Howard, was hoping for were not going to arrive in time, and that meant the 1st and 11th Corps were left to fight their doomed battle north and west of town alone. As for Meade's decision to put Hancock temporarily in charge at Gettysburg, it was, perhaps, as Howard supposed, a particular statement of distrust for the 11th Corps commander. Or, perhaps, Meade simply had complete confidence in Hancock and believed that his recent conversations with that general gave the 2nd Corps commander a greater understanding of Meade's current thinking than Howard or even Reynolds could have had.
Such considerations, however, would have to be consciously deferred to some more suitable and more peaceful future hour, since at the present moment both Howard and Hancock strove to ready the Federals on Cemetery Hill for the possibility of a renewed Confederate attack. 3 to 4 hours of daylight still remained after the battered remnants of the 1st and 11th Corps began to take up their positions in and around the cemetery.
Howard was calm, cool, and reassuring, while Hancock was animated, vigorous, and thoroughly inspiring the troops with his mere presence. The two generals wisely saw the need to hold neighboring Culp's Hill as well, just to the east of Cemetery Hill, and sent 1st Corps troops over to take possession of its previously unoccupied slopes.
And then help was on the way, albeit belatedly. That afternoon, Howard had sent renewed and more urgent messages to 12th Corps Commander Henry Slocum, who was just 4 miles down the Baltimore Pike at 2 taverns. Howard's first afternoon message must have reached Slocum about the time the fighting flared up again at Gettysburg, so the roar of battle certainly added emphasis and urgency to Howard's request.
The combined effect of Howard's first afternoon message and the sound of battle was enough of a jolt that Slocum nerved himself to set aside Meade's Pipe Creek circular and set off at last to help Howard at Gettysburg. No sooner had the 12th Corps taken up its march to Gettysburg than an order arrived from Meade, urging Slocum to make for Gettysburg as rapidly as possible. The message was too late to change anything, but it no doubt made Slocum feel a good deal better about what he had decided to do.
By late afternoon, the 12th Corps was getting close to the east side of Gettysburg, while the Confederates were driving in the Federal lines north and west of town. At Howard's request, Slocum split up his corps' 2 divisions and sent them toward opposite ends of what had been the Union line. One division to extend the left flank of the 1st Corps, and the other division to extend the right flank of the 11th Corps. However, before the new 12th Corps troops could go into their widely separated positions at opposite ends of the battlefield, Federal forces were streaming back through town in full retreat.
Brigadier General Alpheus Williams' division, which had been heading for the right of the old 11th Corps position, actually began deploying in preparation to attack the flank of Jubal Early's Confederates north of town. But then it became apparent that in doing so, Williams' small division would be entirely on its own. The obvious course of action for the 12th Corps now was to bolster the new Cemetery Hill position rather than attempt to salvage the old one north and west of town.
However, at the command level, confusion continued regarding Henry Slocum's whereabouts. Informed of Hancock's presence on Cemetery Hill and Meade's orders giving Hancock command of the battlefield, Slocum apparently assumed that his own presence wasn't required there, and so remained with his troops.
In fact, Meade hadn't intended for the order to place Hancock over Slocum, but rather only over Howard and, if necessary, Sickles. Eventually, the generals on the spot got the situation sorted out, and Slocum, as senior officer present, duly took overall command of the Federal forces at Gettysburg. And for those of you keeping count, Slocum was the 6th officer to hold that responsibility since sunrise. There had been Buford, Reynolds, Doubleday, Howard, Hancock, and now Slocum. However, Henry Slocum had very little idea of what Meade expected of him, and in a brief dispatch written late that evening, wrote, quote, "Unless I receive orders from you before midnight, I shall assume that the other corps are coming up and that the battle is to be fought here tomorrow."
About the same time that evening, Dan Sickles and the 3rd Corps approached the Gettysburg area from the south on the Emmitsburg Road. Like Slocum, Sickles had found himself on the horns of a dilemma that day, having, on the one hand, received desperate requests for help from Howard at Gettysburg, but on the other hand, being bound by orders from Army headquarters to stay where he was before falling back to Pipe Creek.
After some hesitation and attempts to contact Meade for clarification, Sickles put most of his corps on the road for Gettysburg. His leading troops arrived at the southern edge of the battlefield shortly after 6 p.m. With the 3rd Corps approaching and the 12th Corps not yet in position, the combined 1st and 11th Corps strength on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill was probably a little less than 7,000 men. That included the 2,200 fresh troops of Orland Smith's brigade, and fewer than 5,000 survivors of the day's fighting north and west of town. All in all, a sad remnant of the 14,200 1st and 11th Corps soldiers who had gone into action on July 1st. But bolstering the defenses on Cemetery Hill was the battered Federals' ace in the hole, some 43 pieces of artillery that were ideally positioned to break up any renewed Confederate attack. The question for Howard, Hancock, and all the rest of the Federals there late that afternoon and evening was whether the Confederates would attack, and if so, whether they could be held off. That was also the question for Robert E. Lee and his lieutenants.
That means it's time to start to wrap up this episode.
And as we sign off, we want to thank the newest members of the Strawfoot Brigade who have went over to Patreon and signed up to support the podcast. George, Bernal, Brian, John, Peter, Robin, and James.
Ryan, Michael, Matt, Patrick, Matthew, Tom, Brad, and Javier.
And thanks to Mike T. and MC and Stephen for their donations.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Rich and I do hope that you'll join us again next time. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.